All right, so diving in today, we're tackling personalism
Ah, yes.
and, using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide. And I think for anyone, especially those with a philosophical background like yourself, the first thing that jumps out is that it's not so much a rigid doctrine.
Right.
It's more like a current, right?
Yeah, it's this pervasive kind of way of thinking.
Exactly. And it cuts across all sorts of areas, philosophy, theology, you name it. It's got its fingers on a lot of pies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as you were just saying, right from the get-go, the encyclopedia entry kind of clues us in. It's not like a system you can just neatly box up.
Yeah.
It's more of this shared lens, this fundamental approach to philosophical questions that consistently says, hey, the person, that's where it all starts.
Right. And that's not even just a focus, it's the focus.
Exactly.
For a lot of folks in this current, the person is like the ultimate explanation, right? It's the bedrock for understanding knowledge, so epistemology, existence, like ontology, and even what we value, axiology. It's a pretty hefty claim, right?
It is. It's putting the person right at the center of everything. The person becomes the key to unlocking reality, to understanding what's really real.
Yeah.
But, even with that central focus, the encyclopedia makes it clear that there's quite a bit of variation in how that focus plays out, how different thinkers interpret and apply it. It's a broad spectrum, for sure.
That's what makes it so interesting, especially from a philosophical standpoint. The sheer variety within personalism is kind of remarkable. Maritain, right, he said there are at least a dozen personalist doctrines out there that, well, they really only share the word person in common.
Yeah, exactly. It's more of a family resemblance than a strict, singular set of doctrines.
So it's less about pinning down a single ism and more about recognizing this shared current, this distinct worldview with some common threads running through it.
Precisely.
And those common threads. Well, the encyclopedia lays out a few key affirmations. First and foremost, right, is the centrality of personhood.
Right.
And that's not just limited to human beings either. It often extends to the divine as well.
Right. A lot of these thinkers are working within a theistic framework.
And they emphasize the inherent significance of each person, their unique individuality, and their inviolable nature.
Yes, and I think what's important here is the relational aspect as well. This isn't a philosophy of isolated individuals. It's not about rugged individualism.
Right.
It's about recognizing that to be a person is to be in relationship, to be social.
That really comes through in the source material.
Yeah.
And I think what's also fascinating is, it's not all just theoretical, right? There's a very real emphasis on the practical and the moral implications of this worldview. The encyclopedia is very clear on that point.
Absolutely.
It's about how our understanding of the person shapes our ethics, our moral frameworks, and vice versa, right? Our actual lived moral experiences, they feed back into and refine our theoretical understanding of what it means to be a person. It's a two-way street.
Yeah, there's this dynamic interplay. I think that's really key for any philosopher wrestling with these ideas.
Definitely. And what's interesting for a philosopher especially is how personalism tries to hold these seemingly paradoxical aspects of the person together. You've got subjectivity and objectivity, our capacity for action, and our receptivity, our unique individuality, alongside this fundamental need for connection.
And even the interplay between our stable identity, who we are, and this ongoing creativity, this capacity for change and growth.
It's a pretty holistic picture, right?
Yeah, it's a much more integrated view of the person than you often find in other philosophical systems. It's not just chopping us up into different compartments.
Now, the encyclopedia also does this interesting thing where it talks about these different branches within personalism, right? You have this distinction between strict personalism and personalism in a broader sense. I wonder if you can sort of, unpack those a little bit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So strict personalism, often it takes this direct, almost intuitive grasp of the person as its starting point. It dives right into the experience of being a person. And it leans heavily on methods like phenomenology, studying consciousness, lived experience, and also existentialism.
Right.
Exploring the meaning of existence. Thinkers in this camp, they tend to really emphasize self-awareness, that direct encounter with values. Personalism in a broader sense is a little different. It might still hold the person as central, but it situates that within a more comprehensive metaphysical framework.
Okay.
So the justification for the person's value isn't necessarily this primary intuition of the person. It's coming from somewhere else.
Right. So, for instance, Thomistic personalism would be a good example of this broader approach.
Yeah, exactly. They're drawing on the whole system of Thomas Aquinas. So they've got this general metaphysics underpinning their understanding of the person and their significance in the scheme of things.
Okay, that makes sense. And speaking of Aquinas, the encyclopedia points out this interesting relationship between personalism and the concept of God. It notes this strong historical and, for many, intrinsic link to biblical theism. There's even a quote from Balthasar, I think it was, saying that personalism is essentially inconceivable without this background.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. A lot of the core ideas in personalism are really rooted in theological reflections, thinking about the nature of God, the relationship between God and humanity.
Right.
But I think it's also important to acknowledge that the emphasis on the inherent value of the person, their relational nature, it can in principle be adopted and explored even without a belief in God.
Yeah. I mean, this encyclopedia does mention that there are atheist personalists out there.
Right, exactly. It's not like a one-to-one relationship with theism. And you also have to remember the sheer breadth of personalism's application, as the source mentions.
Right.
It goes way beyond philosophy and theology. You find personalist principles being used in economics and ecology, even psychology.
It's a pretty wide-reaching current of thought.
Yeah, it's definitely not confined to the ivory tower.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the historical side of things. The encyclopedia points out that the actual term personalism doesn't really appear until the late 18th century with Schleiermacher. Then you have figures like Alcott and Whitman in America in the mid-19th century. Later, folks like Renouvier and Fluelling really kind of solidify its usage in the early 20th century. But what's interesting from a historical perspective is that even though the term itself is relatively recent, the ideas that underpin it have a much longer pedigree, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. There's a much deeper history there. Knudsen makes this great point. He talks about personalism being like the ripe fruit of centuries of philosophical inquiry, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle.
Right, right. And especially for Catholic personalists, they often trace it back to medieval thought, and particularly, of course, to Aquinas.
Yeah, Aquinas, even though he wouldn't have called himself a personalist, his emphasis on the uniqueness of the individual person, the whole idea that we have this capacity for reason and self-mastery, it's all there.
It definitely prefigures later personalist ideas.
Yeah.
And Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, he even saw Aquinas as a point of departure for his own personalist philosophy.
Absolutely. And to really understand how the concept of the person itself has developed, we've got to look at the theological side of things as well.
Right.
The Latin term persona, it's from the Greek prosopon, and originally it just meant a mask, like in a play, a role an actor takes on.
Interesting. So how did that evolve into this incredibly rich philosophical concept?
Well, it took on this whole new level of significance in the early church. They were wrestling with these complex doctrines, the Trinity and the Incarnation.
Right. Big question.
Exactly. They were trying to figure out the relationship between one hypostasis, meaning substance, and three prosopa, meaning persons, within the Trinity.
Yeah.
And then how to understand the hypostatic union, Christ being both fully divine and fully human.
One person, two natures. It's a mind bender for sure.
Yeah, it really forced them to dig deep into what person really meant.
Right. And then you have this classic definition from Boethius, right? Persona est naturae rationalis individua substantia, an individual substance of a rational nature.
Yeah, that's foundational. It captures those core elements that we are individual beings with this capacity for reason. That's what makes us persons.
Right. But it sounds like that definition was just the starting point.
Exactly. The meaning of person within personalism, it's gone through a lot of transformations since then.
Okay.
It moved beyond that initial idea of an external mask or just a social role.
Right. It's become something much more profound, more interior.
Yeah. Throughout the Middle Ages, you have thinkers like Augustine with his focus on interiority, self-knowledge, and the Franciscan school, they were really interested in the will, in the unique singularity of each being.
And then you have the Renaissance, which really emphasized the dignity and multifaceted nature of human personality. So you see this gradual enrichment of the concept of the person over time.
Absolutely. It's not a static concept. It's always evolving. And then you get into the early modern period, And subjectivity really takes center stage.
Yeah, with folks like Descartes and Kant.
Exactly. Kant's ideas were hugely influential, especially his epistemic dualism, that sharp division between the knowing subject and the object of knowledge.
Right. That sets the stage for various forms of personalism to emerge.
For sure. And don't forget about his concept of human dignity. That idea of intrinsic worth, of being an end in ourselves, not just a means to an end.
Yeah, that's a key idea for personalism, and it's something Kant really hammered home.
Yeah.
And his categorical imperative, too. That was a huge influence, especially on later personalists like Lucia.
Right. That idea that you should never treat another person as a mere means to an end, it's foundational for a lot of personalist ethics.
Now, getting back to the historical context, the encyclopedia points out that personalism emerged as a reaction against a lot of the impersonal philosophies of the Enlightenment and the Romantic era.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Spinoza with his pantheism, and then you have Hegel and absolute idealism.
Yeah, systems that seem to diminish the significance of the individual.
Right. They didn't leave a lot of room for individual freedom or agency. And you had folks like Jacobi, he was one of the early critics of Spinoza, and the later Schelling. They both played key roles in pushing back against these impersonal systems.
So there was already this kind of nascent counter-movement brewing even back then.
Yeah, for sure. And it included a group called the speculative theists,
Right.
and they really laid the groundwork for the more fully developed personalist schools of thought that would come later in both Europe and America.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how these ideas traveled across the Atlantic.
Absolutely. Lot's a really interesting figure who bridged speculative theology and philosophy. His ideas had a big impact on both Bound's American idealistic personalism and Pringle Pattison's work in British idealism.
Right. It shows that these weren't just isolated movements, they were connected in important ways.
And the encyclopedia also notes this fascinating point. Even before the 20th century, you can see the basic elements of the personalist critique taking shape.
Yeah, it wasn't just a vague sense of unease. They were starting to articulate specific objections.
Exactly. And while later personalists found common ground with things like phenomenology, existentialism, and Thomism, the core concerns were already there. The individual's freedom, dignity, and significance in the face of these large impersonal systems.
So personalism wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction. It was a response to very specific philosophical trends. Hegelian idealism, for instance, with its idea of an absolute mind that absorbs individual consciousness, that was a big target.
Right. And then the way Hegelianism morphed into materialistic ideologies like Marxism and later deterministic systems like communism.
And, of course, the horrific collectivism of Nazism. All of these things really solidify the personalist opposition to any philosophy that basically tries to dissolve the individual into the collective. It was about drawing a line in the sand.
Absolutely. And the core principle, as the encyclopedia says, was that the person should never be a mere means to an end. Fluing even saw a direct link between personalism and democracy. He thought of the person as the supreme essence of democracy, hostile to totalitarianisms.
Yeah, there's this deep connection to certain political values as well.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia does a good job of highlighting the personalist critique of things like philosophical positivism, which really focuses on society as the primary unit of analysis and sees the individual as just an abstraction.
Right. And then there's Darwinism, which for many personalists seem to reduce the difference between humans and other animals to a mere matter of degree rather than a fundamental difference in kind.
Right. And personalism also takes aim at radical individualism.
Yeah, the kind that emerges from certain interpretations of rationalism and romanticism.
Right. So while they absolutely affirm the value and autonomy of the individual, personalists also emphasize the inherent communitarian dimension of human existence.
It's about holding those two things in tension, the individual and the community.
Exactly. And Meunier's distinction between the decentralization that's necessary for personal life and the centralizing tendencies of individualism, that really captures the nuance there, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a really insightful way to think about it.
And then you have Watier's distinction between individualism, which prioritizes the individual good over the common good, often leading to things like unchecked liberalism and capitalism.
And collectivism, which subordinates the individual to the state or the collective, often resulting in totalitarianism.
Right. It's about finding that balance, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the relationship with existentialism is fascinating too. While existentialism, especially in its early forms, really zeroed in on the immediate experience of being human, trying to make sense of that.
Personals like Kierkegaard went further and really emphasized the underlying nature and inherent worth of the person. So there's a subtle but important difference there.
Right. And then there's Nietzsche, this really complex figure. He was critical of romanticism, but in a way, he kind of revealed how extreme individualism can actually end up in a kind of impersonalism.
Yeah, where the ego wants to dissolve into some larger whole. It's a strange paradox. But overall, the 19th century seemed to be chipping away at the unique significance of the person, right?
Yeah, reducing human beings to just appearances or just cogs in some larger machine, whether it's nature, idealism, the unconscious, whatever.
Right. And personalism comes along and says, no, wait a minute. The person is not just something to be explained away or assimilated.
Exactly. And it draws on all sorts of resources, philosophical and theological, to try to rescue the unique position and status of the singular human person, as the encyclopedia puts it.
Right. LaCroix even calls personalism an anti-ideology, a stance against anything that dehumanizes or alienates.
And Maritain sees it as a necessary reaction against both totalitarianism and radical individualism.
It's about affirming our inherent dignity as persons and our interconnectedness, both at the same time.
Exactly. It's a both-hand kind of thing.
Now, moving into the 20th century, the encyclopedia highlights three main centers for the development of European personalism.
Mm.
You have Paris, Munich, and Lublin. And the Parisian group, especially the folks around the journal Esprit, which was founded by Emmanuel Mounier in 1932, they were doing some really interesting work in the interwar period.
Yeah, a time of a lot of social and moral upheaval.
Exactly. And Mounier was really sharp in his critique of what he saw as impersonal forces at work,
Yes.
even within democratic societies,
Yeah.
even in the midst of this burgeoning mass culture.
Right. He was skeptical of the idea that just having liberal democratic structures was enough to safeguard against things like totalitarianism.
Right. It was about going deeper, looking at the underlying philosophical assumptions about the person.
Exactly. If those are still rooted in impersonal or materialistic ideas, then the structures themselves won't be enough.
And Mounier wasn't just advocating for some kind of traditionalism either.
Mhm.
He had this vision of a real revolution that would create a new humanism.
Right. He wanted to prioritize being over having authentic communion with others over just material accumulation.
And he believed this revolution had to start at the individual level, through inner renewal and a commitment to living out one's faith or one's deeply held values.
Yeah, it was about individual transformation leading to social transformation.
And his concept of tragic optimism, I thought that was really interesting. This idea that Christian experience, and I think you could broaden that to any authentic spiritual experience, involves this embrace of both the joy and the suffering of life.
Right. It's not about naive optimism. It's about facing the darkness, but still holding on to hope. And he really saw the committed Christian, the person of faith, as almost like an athlete, disciplined, watchful, standing in opposition to Nietzsche's Superman.
Yeah, he even talked about the need for transcendence, something that goes beyond just material well-being. He saw that as essential for true progress, unlike the Marxist vision of a purely earthly paradise.
And he also emphasized the importance of freedom and responsibility, alongside insights from psychology. He was wary of the more deterministic elements of Freudian psychoanalysis.
So a pretty complex and nuanced thinker, right?
Yeah, Mounier was definitely ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
And his influence spread beyond France as well.
Yeah.
You have other French thinkers like Gabriel Marcel, Denis de Rougemont, and Jacques Maritain.
Right. They were all connected to Mounier and Esprit in various ways, and they helped to further develop and spread French personalist thought.
Maritain, in particular, was a key figure in bringing those ideas to the United States. And later, he played a really important role in drafting the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah, his impact was huge. And it's interesting to see how his own thinking developed over time, how he became more critical of scholasticism and really emphasized the role of intuition in philosophy.
The connection with Paul Ricoeur is also interesting, even though he didn't explicitly identify as a personalist. His work, especially his engagement with Husserlian phenomenology, really overlaps with a lot of personalist themes. Human freedom, the relationship between the individual and the state, the importance of ethical action.
Yeah, he was definitely influenced by personalism, especially through his early interactions with Mounier and his contributions to Esprit and the Christianism social. And that emphasis on the importance of engaging with the political and social realities of your time, that's straight from Mounier.
Right, no ivory tower philosophy for Ricoeur. Now, in Germany, personalism developed in close connection with Husserlian phenomenology.
Yeah, and you can see that in part as a response to the dominant strains of German idealism at the time.
Right. Husserl comes along and says, hey, we need to go back to the things themselves, bracket out all our preconceived notions, and really focus on direct experience and the structure of consciousness.
Right. That emphasis on the first-person perspective, that's really key.
Yeah. And while Husserl himself later moved towards idealism, his earlier work, especially that emphasis on direct intuition and the phenomenological method, had a huge impact, especially on some of his students who would go on to become major figures in personalism.
Right. Folks like Max Scheler, Dietrich von Hildebrand, Roman Ingarden, and Edith Stein, they all made significant contributions.
And they often diverged from Husserl's later idealism, trying and stay truer to his earlier focus on the direct intuition of reality. Stein's work integrating phenomenology and Thomism is a really fascinating example of that.
Yeah, and Hildebrand developed a whole ethical system that was deeply personalistic.
And then you have the Lublin School in Poland. Roman Ingarden, after studying with Husserl, he brought phenomenology and personalism back to Poland, and that's where he encountered Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope John Paul II.
Yeah, that was a pivotal meeting. Ingarden encouraged Wojtyła to read Scheler, and that led to Wojtyła's doctoral work on Scheller's ethics, which laid the foundation for his own personalistic synthesis.
He combined Thomism and phenomenology in a really creative way.
Absolutely. He became a professor in Krakow and Lublin and basically founded the Polish school of personalist thought. And his books, Love and Responsibility, The Acting Person, they're really important works in the personalist tradition.
And then, of course, as Pope John Paul II, he had this huge global platform to share his ideas.
Right. His papacy had a huge impact on the spread of personalist thought, both within the church and beyond.
Definitely. And the encyclopedia does point out that personalism in Europe wasn't limited to just these three main centers. It was a much broader phenomenon, finding expression in lots of different countries throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, it was a really widespread intellectual movement.
Now, shifting to American personalism, the encyclopedia highlights this interesting difference from the European variety. Instead of being a reaction against idealism, American personalism was often itself a form of idealism.
Right. It tended to define ultimate reality in terms of personal consciousness.
Right. Howison's personal idealism is a good example of that.
Yeah, that's a good one. And American personalism really emerged as a continuation of 19th century European thought, especially the speculative theists and their critiques of impersonalism.
So there's a continuity there, but also a distinct flavor to the American version.
Yeah, for sure. And while both European and American personalists generally agreed on the person being central, the American school really leaned into the speculative theological tradition.
Whereas the Europeans engaged more with things like existentialism, phenomenology, and Thomism.
Exactly. Different tools for a similar project.
And Boston University became a real hub for American personalism under Borden Parker Bound.
Right. He studied with Lotz, who was influenced by Fichte and was trying to rework Hegel into a form of personal idealism.
So Bound had this really interesting lineage. And his book, Personalism, which came out in 1908, really introduced the term into American philosophy.
Yeah, he was a key figure. And he had some really influential followers, too, like Brightman, Medson, McConnell, Coe, Fluelling.
A whole generation of personalist thinkers.
Absolutely. And Fluelling was really important in establishing personalism on the West Coast at USC. He also founded the Personalist Journal, which became a major platform for personalist ideas.
And American personalism had a surprisingly broad impact. I mean, you even have Martin Luther King Jr., who studied with personalists like Brightman and DeWolf at Boston University.
Right. That had a huge influence on his thinking.
Yeah, his whole idea that the clue to the meaning of ultimate reality is found in personality, that's pure personalism.
Absolutely. And it shaped his views on God, on the inherent dignity of all human beings.
It's a great example of how these philosophical ideas can have real-world consequences.
Definitely. And it's important to remember that American personalism wasn't just a Boston thing.
Right.
It was also flourishing at Harvard. You have folks like James, Royce, Hawking, and Hartshorne.
So a pretty vibrant and diverse intellectual scene.
Yeah, personalism had a lot of different expressions in America.
Now, turning to Eastern thought, the encyclopedia acknowledges the challenges of cross-cultural philosophical comparison, but it does point to some intriguing parallels and potential equivalents in Islamic, Buddhist, Vedantic, and Chinese thought.
Right, but you always have to be careful with translations and interpretations. It's easy to impose Western categories onto non-Western traditions.
Absolutely. So with Islam, it's interesting because classical Islamic philosophy, with its roots in Greek thought, doesn't have a direct equivalent to the Western concept of person.
Yeah, and that makes sense because the concept of person, as we understand it, it really developed within the context of Christian theology, particularly the doctrine of the Trinity.
Right. But even though there's no exact equivalent, you can find themes in modern Islamic thought that resonate with personalism.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Muhammad Iqbal, for example.
Right. And Abdelaziz Lababi actually explicitly tried to develop a Muslim personalism, drawing on the ideas of Monnier.
So there's definitely cross-pollination happening there. And with other Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Chinese thought, it's tricky because they don't share that same historical and conceptual link to Greek philosophy.
Right. So when people talk about personalism in those contexts, they're often referring to themes or positions that resemble Western personalism, particularly ideas about the self and the individual.
Yeah. And it's important to be precise about what we're comparing.
Absolutely. The Pugalavada school in early Buddhism, for example, with its views on personal identity and continuity, that's one area where people have drawn parallels. And there are similar ideas in some Mahayana Buddhist schools as well.
Right. But Vedanta, one of the major schools of Hindu philosophy, offers some of the clearest parallels.
Okay. And within Vedanta, it's the Vishishtadvaita school, right? The one that emphasizes a personal Brahman.
Exactly. They see ultimate reality as personal, and they view individual selves as distinct but inseparable from that personal Brahman.
Right. So that's a pretty strong point of contact with Western personalism.
Mhm.
And Vishishtadvaita draws on Samkhya philosophy, yoga practices, and a lot of Hindu scripture. So it's a very well-developed system.
Absolutely. And it's teaching on the Atman, the permanent self, that's really central. And I think it makes it a more straightforward comparison point than something like the Pugalavada, where the interpretations are more debated.
Yeah, it's a clearer case.
Ah.
And it's fascinating how these debates within Vedanta between non-dualist and personalist interpretations mirror some of the Western debates between absolute idealism and personalistic idealism.
Right. That impersonal versus personal understanding of ultimate reality, that's a recurring theme.
Absolutely. But the encyclopedia does point out that there's still not a lot of comparative work that really digs into those connections beyond the usual comparison between Advaita Vedanta and absolute idealism. So there's a lot of room for further research there.
For sure. And one key difference to keep in mind is that Vedantic personalism usually builds its understanding of the person on this idea of a true self that transcends the body and the finite mind, whereas Western personalism often defines the person at the level of mental experience or even physical embodiment.
Right. So different starting points.
Exactly. But it's important to note that Vedantic personalism doesn't devalue the body or the mind completely. It's more about recognizing that our true self is something deeper than those things.
Right. And they see the realization of our true nature, the Sat Chidananda, as something that illuminates and transforms both the body and the mind.
Yeah, it's about bringing that deeper awareness into our everyday experience.
Now, with Chinese and Japanese thought, you have traditions like Confucianism, Taoism, and the various schools of Buddhism that developed there.
Right, like Zen Buddhism.
And they all emphasize these practical methods of character transformation.
Right, it's about living the philosophy, not just thinking about it.
And those Buddhist traditions often developed in ways that were somewhat detached from the more theoretical frameworks of Indian Buddhism.
Right, they were more focused on direct experience and practice.
And you see a similar practical emphasis in Taoism.
Absolutely. But in many of these traditions, ultimate reality is still conceived of as fundamentally impersonal.
Right, which sets them apart from Western personalism.
Yeah, there's a greater distance there.
Confucianism is interesting. It's very focused on ethical cultivation and social harmony.
Right, the development of the ideal person, the gentleman, who embodies those virtues.
And while that humanistic focus has some overlap with personalism, Confucianism doesn't really emphasize the same kind of radical individuality and subjective experience that you find in Western personalism.
Right, it's more about realizing these universal ideals of human flourishing.
And Neo-Confucianism, with figures like Chu Si, brought in more metaphysical ideas. But even there, the emphasis is often on these generalistic principles rather than individual uniqueness.
Right. And there are ongoing debates about whether Confucianism can really be considered a form of personalism.
Yeah, it's a complex case. But despite all the diversity we've seen across these different schools and traditions, the encyclopedia does a good job of highlighting some general characteristics that are pretty consistent across personalist thought.
Yeah, those core commitments that run through all the different varieties.
Exactly. So the first one is this really strong insistence on a fundamental difference between persons and non-persons. This idea that Persons can't be reduced to impersonal factors, whether it's matter or spirit.
Right. And that really challenges the Darwinian idea that the difference between humans and other animals is just a matter of degree.
Yeah, human exceptionalism is a big theme here,
Yeah.
but obviously a nuanced one.
Right. It's not about saying that humans are superior in every way. It's about recognizing a fundamental difference in kind.
And personalists draw on a long tradition of philosophical anthropology to support this idea.
Uh,
They argue that there's this radical ontological divide between persons and non-persons.
right. You can't just explain the person away by reducing them to something less.
And they're pushing back against materialism, determinism, but even just purely objectivist views of human beings.
Like the idea that we're just rational animals.
Right. They might accept that definition to some extent, but they see it as incomplete. It doesn't capture the fullness of our subjective experience.
Yeah, there's something more to us than just our biological makeup.
Right. And the core idea seems to be that while we can treat everything, including ourselves, as objects of study, persons have this unique status of being a somebody, not just a something.
Right. And that distinction owes a lot to the Judeo-Christian tradition, as well as to Cartesian thought, with its emphasis on consciousness.
And the key point is that only humans are typically understood as being both object and subject at the same time. We can be aware of ourselves as both the observer and the observed.
And that's where subjectivity comes in. It's that irreducible core of what makes us persons. Now, broader realist personalists often ground this difference between persons and non-persons in our capacity for reason and language.
Right. Those are seen as the foundations for subjectivity. So subjectivity itself has an objective basis in our rational nature.
Exactly. And this view maintains a pretty clear separation between non-personal beings and the unique subjectivity of the person.